Welcome to the family, son.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. This time we've got a game that I absolutely loved as a teenager but somehow managed to never finish. It's Parasite Eve 2 for the PlayStation 1. Let's get this quest underway. The original Parasite Eve had fairly good reviews, with the average being about 80%, but its big success came from its sales figures, shipping just under 1 million units in the first half of 1998 in Japan alone, making it one of the best-selling games of the year. Now this figure doesn't seem to be anything special against today's standards, but at the time it really was quite noteworthy. And of course, with this success, it was pretty much inevitable that we would get a sequel, and fans wouldn't have to wait too long, as in 1999 in Japan and 2000 in the US and Europe, that's exactly what gamers got. But the sequel would take a different approach from the original. It's clear from the outset that somebody at Squaresoft was really chasing that sweet Resident Evil fame, and they thought that was the best direction to take this franchise. But more about that later. The story picks up 3 years after Aya's battle with Eve and the Ultimate Being. She's now working with the FBI as a member of the Mitochondrial Investigation and Suppression Team, or MIST for short. After testing her skills at the firing range, Aya is dispatched to a disturbance at the Acropolis Tower in Los Angeles. She arrives at the scene just in time to see the flaming wreckage of a helicopter fall from the sky at the base of the tower. Aya gleans whatever information she can from the surrounding police officers before boarding an elevator to investigate the scene herself. Upon her arrival at the top floor, she's greeted with a scene of absolute horror. There's blood and slumped over bodies everywhere. Something has managed to tear apart an entire SWAT team. After a short time exploring the scene, Aya finds a surviving SWAT member who tells her about a civilian who's hiding in the cafeteria and gives her the key to get in. On her way to save the civilian, Aya has a run-in with some neo-mitochondrian creatures, or NMCs for short. Easily dispatching the creatures with her Beretta, she heads for the cafeteria. Finding the civilian, Aya tries to help her, but all is not what it seems. The woman falls to the floor and begins to transform in a horrific manner into an NMC, forcing Aya to draw her gun and neutralize her. Upon investigation of the creature, Aya finds and takes a metal implant from behind its ear to take back to MIST headquarters. And then, just as she turns to leave, the monstrosity comes back to life and Aya is luckily saved by another MIST team member, Rupert Broderick. After this altercation in the cafeteria, the pair go their separate ways to further investigate the tower. Aya confronts several new types of NMC, finds herself a really fun weapon, and tries to make her way further up the tower. Upon entering a chapel, she's able to return the favour and save Rupert from a bizarre masked man in some sort of military garb, who escapes by jumping through a window far too high for the average human to reach. Aya checks to see if Rupert's okay and then carries on to explore the rooftop garden. It's here when she overhears a soldier talking on his radio. He exclaims that recapture is impossible, that this is going to be another New York incident all over again, and that all the evidence will be destroyed. It turns out the tower's been rigged with explosives. So after solving a few puzzles, Aya finally makes her way to the roof and is confronted by number 9, the masked man who attacked Rupert. He claims to be a hunter just like Aya and attacks, but Aya uses her surroundings and manages to electrocute the masked assailant. After chasing him to the helicopter pad, he escapes by jumping to a neighbouring building. Rupert makes his way to Aya. He's got a detonator in his hand, but it's too late to disarm the bombs. Luckily, a helicopter arrives to pick up the duo, and they escape just in time as a building explodes as they fly away. Mere hours later, Aya is with her boss, Eric, Hal Baldwin, in his office. He hands her a pretty amusing article about cattle mutilation. He believes that this is signs of NMC activity in the Mojave Desert, specifically the town of Dryfield, and with this, Aya is sent out on another assignment. While preparing her car to leave, Aya is approached by another colleague, Pierce Carradine. He tells her that the metal implant that she recovered from the NMC at Acropolis Tower is used to control the NMCs, and also it has traces of sand from the Mojave Desert. the plot thickens. So Aya gets in her muscle car and races to the small yet largely unpopulated town of Dryfield, Nevada. This is where the story opens up a little bit more, so I'll leave the explanation of it here for now and move on to discussing the gameplay and how it differs from the first game. As you can probably tell from some of the clips that I've already shown, this game is very different from the first. The combat is no longer an action RPG style with an attack meter and random encounters. The enemies are visible on the screen and you're free to engage them at will. That said, when you do start combat, it does enter you into a combat encounter where you're locked into a certain area, much like the first game. This time, however, you can attack at will. There's no AT bar to fill and you can freely lock on and choose targets to shoot. The only part of these encounters that stays basically the same from Parasite Eve 1 are Aya's parasite powers. These feel great to use from a more traditional paused RPG state. But as I'm sure you can probably tell by now, this is not my favourite method for combat. But that wasn't always the case. I really loved this game when it came out all those years ago. I mean, look at it this way. When I played the game for this video, I played on my original copy from the late 90s. It made such a positive impression that I never got rid of it, which I can't say about a lot of games. Now I'm sure partly why I don't get along with this control scheme is that it is genuinely clunky and it hasn't aged well, but honestly I think my biggest issue is that I actually went back and played Parasite Eve 1. And then coming back to this, I just wanted more of the first game. I honestly don't want to sound too negative about this because I actually still enjoyed playing the game. I just wish it was different. The inventory management in this game is essentially unchanged from the first, which honestly is an area where they could have made huge changes and I would imagine they would be universally welcome. You have limited inventory space, which in itself is not an issue. It's something I actually enjoyed in Resident Evil, but that series had something that this is sorely missing: the universal item box. That single addition would have made this game feel so much better. In both Parasite Eve 1 and 2, you can store your excess items in boxes and vehicles, but you have to retrieve them from the exact box or vehicle that you put them in. Parasite Eve 2 does have one saving grace, that very deep into the endgame, you can visit a soldier and he does give you access to all of your stash boxes. But this really is late into the game. For an example of how late game this is, I had already died fighting the penultimate boss at least 5 times before deciding to grind for items when purely by accident I found this life-saving soldier. And that leads me to my next point. This game really does have a considerable difficulty spike as you get into the last area. And though I can't remember exactly what happened 20 plus years ago, I'm almost certain that this is the reason that I never completed the game when I first bought it. Right, well I feel like I've been negative enough for now, so let's move on to something that is by far more positive in nature: the graphics and sound. Now this is where I feel the game really is at its strongest. Maybe if you don't have the same levels of nostalgia for PS1 graphics that I do, it might just look like a bunch of janky triangles smashed together, but for me this holds up really well. The 3D models look nice and clean with a decent amount of polygons, but of course the star of the show was the pre-rendered backgrounds. For the time they were really very detailed, there's blinking lights and animated sections, that kind of thing. It really helped make these areas feel like real living spaces. Most of the sections of this game had a really nice level of atmosphere to them, which was underpinned by this game's fantastic soundtrack. Unlike Parasite Eve 1, the real value of this soundtrack comes from the ambient tracks. They really go a long way to adding a really spooky sci-fi feel to the areas, and much like the first game, it does still have some absolute bangers of tracks, notably the remix of Primal Eyes from Parasite Eve 1, which is now renamed Forbidden Power. It's really quite an achievement from, at the time, a relatively unknown Naoshi Mizuta, but... and I know I sound like a broken record here, it's not as good as the Parasite Eve 1 soundtrack. But if you're coming a close second to Yoko Shimomura, that's not too bad a place to be in. Okay, so that's it for the gameplay and presentation. Let's head back to the story and see how it unfolds. Even though this game is over 20 years old, I'll drop a spoiler warning here. So, go to the timestamp at the top of the screen if you don't want the story spoiled for you. If not, here we go. Right, let's pick up where we left off. So as Aya is exploring Dryfield, she meets two people. A PI named Carl Madigan, who's got his own investigation going, who she teams up with, and the owner of the motel and auto shop in town, Gary Douglas, who tells her about an abandoned prepper bunker close by called The Shelter that was bought up by an unnamed big company a few years prior. Soon after Aya gets this lead in her case, she is once again confronted by Number 9, only this time she loses control and sets him on fire, much like Melissa in the first Parasite Eve, and then she passes out and has a strange vision of a young girl who seems familiar. When she finally comes to, it's nightfall, and following a small misunderstanding with Kyle, they head to her car to get moving out, but the car's not looking so good, it's been destroyed by NMCs. Luckily, Mr. Douglas agrees to lend them his truck, but it needs an oil leak fixed and it also needs fuel. Aya looks for the fuel while Mr. Douglas works on the truck. Once Aya finds the fuel, Mr. Douglas sends her to get some rest because he needs more time. But after a nice hot shower and a little nap, the town is attacked by a giant NMC called the Burner. This hulking brute is no match for Aya. She quickly dispatches it and her and Kyle head towards the shelter. And after making their way through an abandoned mine, they find their way into the shelter. Facing even more deadly NMCs, Aya explores the high-tech facility, and it's here where on one of the computers she finds the key to all the events that have transpired. The second Neoteny plan. This plan consists of using neo-mitochondria to force human evolution, but after initial tests were unsuccessful, this secretive cabal needed a stronger neo-mitochondrian sample which they would use to clone viable test subjects. So the creatures in this game are not the same as the first. These are artificial neo-mitochondrian creatures, or ANMCs for short, and the sample they chose came from Aya herself. All these creatures she's been killing are her clones. Aya, feeling personally responsible, redoubles her effort to stopping this plan. So she forges on, but it's not long before things get even worse. She finds the existence of an ultimate ANMC which is being grown. This ANMC would be capable of spreading this rogue neo-mitochondria through what is known as a vector virus. If this plan's allowed to come to fruition, the human race is doomed. So Aya forges ahead and finds herself in another area of the compound called Neo-Arc, which is made up of several different biomes that house various different types of ANMCs designed to excel in varied environments. It's also holding two massive ANMCs being used as biological batteries to power a barrier that's hiding the key to this organization's plan. And that key is a small child in a psi suit and mask, whose role in this plan is to control the ANMCs, and this child is aptly named Eve. Aya battles a giant ANMC called a puppet stinger that Eve is controlling, and once this creature's defeated, she manages to get close to the child and calm her down, removing her helmet and finding a perfect child clone version of herself. She sets out to escape with Eve, but Eve unfortunately is kidnapped by Number 9, who takes her back to the heart of the facility. Aya is then ambushed by an entire army of Golem soldiers. Luckily, the US Marines turn up and absolutely wreck them all. Following a short debriefing with the military, she's allowed to go back into the facility to save Eve. Fighting her way back through the facility to the room with the cocooned Ultimate ANMC, Aya finds Eve, Number 9 and Kyle there. It appears that Kyle's been working with the organization all along, and he shoots Aya. It's here where we find out that Eve is the key to completing the Ultimate ANMC. Once it absorbs and merges with Eve, it will be perfect. But before this can happen, Kyle betrays and shoots Number 9. It turns out he's been a double agent all along, and Number 9 is absorbed by the Ultimate ANMC. Kyle, Aya and Eve see something bright above them. It's a satellite strike authorized by the President of the United States. And as it hits the facility, it causes Eve to fall and the cocoon to split. Kyle is injured, but tells Aya to go after Eve. After reaching the room below, Aya battles with the imperfect Ultimate ANMC, and ultimately, she's victorious. But in its death throes, it's able to absorb Eve and perfect itself, re-emerging as Mitochondrial Eve. Aya once again battles her nemesis from the first game and once again comes out victorious. But not before Eve tries one last ditch effort to kill Aya. Unfortunately, it's too late and Eve disintegrates, leaving Aya to fall. Aya wakes up next to the unchanged clone Eve, with Kyle there to rescue both of them, and with that the credits roll. There are several endings to the game, but the good ending is Aya adopts Eve, and then there's a short post-credit scene where they meet up with Kyle at the Museum of Natural History in New York. So, that's the story of Parasite Eve 2. Let's let everyone else back in, and I'll discuss what I thought of the game. In general, I think Parasite Eve 2 is a bit of a flawed gem. It clearly tried to follow the successes of Resident Evil, but I don't think the two playstyles mixed up as well as they thought they would. The tank controls and slow turning speed can make the action-heavy focus of this game, specifically towards the end, a little bit too hard to manage. And honestly, I feel like I've done nothing but be negative about this game, considering I actually really enjoy it. But it is a game that does have its issues, and you know it's coming, you know I'm going to say it again, it's not as good as Parasite Eve 1. However, Parasite Eve 2 is not without its merits. It has a fantastic story, a good soundtrack, and the graphics are really pretty good for the era. If you enjoyed games like Parasite Eve 1, Resident Evil, Dino Crisis, or Silent Hill, you'll probably find something to like here if you stick to it. I see this game as almost like a action movie sequel, akin to going from Alien to Aliens. It's more bombastic, but perhaps lacks a bit of the substance. Thoroughly enjoyable, but perhaps not as nuanced. So overall, I feel like I'd give Parasite Eve 2 a 7 out of 10. Well worth it if you're into the genre, but perhaps hard to get into now if you weren't around at the time. This video ended up being a little bit longer than I was expecting it to be, so if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please like the video, leave me a comment, join the family by subscribing. Any constructive feedback is always welcome, so drop that down in the comment section as well. Once again, thank you, and I'll see you on the next quest.